Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2022 Tang Prize Master Forum in Sustainable Development. Today, we are immensely honored to have the world's leading experts on the vital issue of sustainability with us to enlighten us about the ways to fulfill a sustainable human society. The venue of the forum today, Green Building Research Center, also known as the Green Magic School, is listed in the IPCC's 2022 report as one of the 7 low and zero energy buildings worldwide. Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs, laureate of the 2022 Tang Prize in Sustainable Development, will soon join us remotely from Vienna. Now, we would like to invite President of National Cheng Kung University, President Su Huizhen, to give her welcome remarks. Welcome, President Su.
Well, good afternoon to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and join us remotely from the internet. And also, warmest welcome to the distinguished guests from the Tang Prize Foundation, including CEO Chen, academician Liu, and also our panelist, Professor Liang, as well as Dean Chen. And particularly, my heartfelt appreciation to all the fellow students who join us from either the neighboring region or the other side of the city. Welcome. I have the immense honor and privilege to be here at National Cheng Kung University, NCKU, to extend my warmest welcome to Professor Jeffrey David Sachs, the distinguished guests along with you all, and the participants. NCKU has proudly formed a deep collaborative connection with the Tang Prize Foundation in the past few years. We organized the Grow Brundtland Week for young female students, scientists, in the field of sustainable development between 2016 and 2018. The 2020 Tang Prize Masters Forum in Biopharmaceutical Sciences was also held in NCKU. We have benefited tremendously from each of these activities. Today, it is another recognition of the fruitful collaboration between us and the Foundation to put forward the 2022 Tang Prize Masters Forum in Sustainable Science. Today's forum focuses on the topic Sustainable Development Pathway toward 2030 and beyond, which aims to keep us ahead in achieving SDGs and moving forward to the 2030 for a better future. We hope to proceed with inspiring dialogues that generate insights about practical measures of achieving the goals. The challenges the world facing in fulfilling the ideal are indeed huge and grim. As the climate change unfolds, extreme weather events occur more frequently and destructively in recent years. For example, just in the summer, 2/3 of the Europe is affected by droughts, likely the worst of such events within the 500 years at the very least. In northern Taiwan, the poorest city, Keelung, well known with its nickname as a rain capital, is also facing the unexpected threat of drought. With the rainfall in July and August this year reduced to only 10 to 20% of the levels of the previous years. Now, conversely, extremely heavy rainfalls have caused severe floods in many other regions worldwide. The floods that hit Eastern Australia in 2022 were one of the worst events recorded in the weather history of that country. Meanwhile, Pakistan suffered even more severe floods just at the end of the last August. The floods killing more than 1,200 people, and 1/3 of the country's land is submerged right now. In response to the climate change, mitigation and adaptation strategies and measures across the international, regional, national, and local levels are generated. At COP26, one commitment is to reduce the global carbon dioxide emissions by 45% by 2030 compared to the 2010 levels. Now, for the goal to limit global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. At the national level in Taiwan, climate-friendly urban planning is being proposed and implemented in view of achieving sustainable city development. And at the city level here, right, in China City, the government begins to conduct the rainfall sharing plan for the frequently flooded Dawan district, hoping to enhance the flood control capacity of that area. Environmental sustainability is closely related to everyone's life. Nations, governments, and individuals should and can make their contributions and play their own roles. As a leading higher institute, NCKU has long claimed our responsibility for realizing the SDGs through education, through research, and through societal engagement. And that makes hosting today's event even so much more relevant and meaningful. Professor Sachs is an esteemed global leader in the study and practice of sustainable development. As we eagerly await for his insights from the upcoming lecture, I'm also confident that our panelists today will also offer stimulating discussions that can generate a great variety of ideas from local, national, and global perspectives, which we should all appreciate. I sincerely wish the forum a great success, and we will all pledge another level of commitment supporting a better shared future as we depart today. Thank you.
Thank you, President Su. Please take your seat. We will now take a group photo. Please remain in your seats and allow our photographer to take a group photo from the stage. We will start our forum after the photo shoot. If you have any questions in the middle of the forum, please submit your questions via the Slido link shown here on the screen. Now, let's invite the moderator of the forum, Dr. Liu Zhaohan, academician of Academia Sinica, former vice president of Academia Sinica, and former president of National Central University, to give his opening remarks and introduce the 2022 Tang Prize Laureate in Sustainable Development. Welcome, Dr. Liu.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 5th Tang Prize Masters Forum for Sustainable Development. I'm Liu Zhaohan, and I'll serve as the moderator for today's forum. Our master for the forum is Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who is the laureate of the 2022 Tang Prize for Sustainable Development. Professor Sachs currently is the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he is also a chair professor. Before he came to Columbia in 2002 to serve as the director of the Earth Institute there, he taught at Harvard for 18 years. And in addition to his duty at Columbia, he is currently also the president of the UN Sustainable Development Solution Network, SDSN, currently considered as the worldwide the biggest think tank for sustainable development. And from 2002 to 2018, he also served as the advisor, as the special advisor to three UN Secretary Generals in those years. And Professor Sachs is widely recognized for his bold and effective strategies to address challenging issues such as debt crisis, hyperinflations, eradication of extreme poverty, and the battle against human-induced climate change. Professor Sachs is a true academic practitioner who has been in the forefront of scholarship, policy advising, practical demonstrations, educational innovation, and global advocacy. He helped to set and promote the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, known as the SDGs now, from their very inception, and worked wholeheartedly to help forge a consensus for the adoption of the goals. Professor Sachs led the highly influential Pathways to Deep Decarbonization and demonstrated how multi-decadal plans to 2050 can, in fact, be designed and implemented. Many countries have followed the idea and planned their deep decarbonization pathways. Professor Sachs will join us today via video from Europe. And the title of his talk today is Sustainable Development, the Future We Wanted. Let's welcome Professor Sachs. Hello, Professor Sachs.
Greetings from Vienna to all of you.
Thank you.
I am so deeply honored and moved by this wonderful award, and I'm so grateful for the chance to be with you. And thank you, Dr. Liu, for your such kind words, and President Su for your wonderful wisdom, and also for your leadership and partnership with the Tang Prize Foundation. I'm, of course, especially grateful to the Tang Prize Foundation and to the selection committee for this incredible honor. And it's such a joy for me. I'm so thankful I have the chance to join other honorees in other categories this year and other honorees in sustainable development in past years, many of my heroes. This is very, very special for me. Thank you also for this Masters Forum, which gives us the chance to discuss the topic of sustainable development in some detail. And I very much look forward to the panel discussion that we will have after my opening remarks. Indeed, I would like to speak about the future that we want. It is our responsibility. It is also our capacity as human beings living in a society to shape the future that we want. It is our responsibility to avoid some of the great risks that now confront humanity and that endanger us today on the planet, as President Su was describing, but also pose dire challenges and threats to our children and children's children and generations that will come. We have a profound capacity and responsibility to shape the future that we want. I'd like to share some slides with you, so I'm going to share my screen and give an overview of the challenge of sustainable development, why it is a unique undertaking. We have a need to do things that no generation before us has had to do or would have had the capacity to do. And when I speak about our generation, I speak about the whole world working together, which by itself is obviously an enormously profound challenge and an unprecedented kind of scope of activity. In the past, we have, of course, faced issues in our local communities, in our nations, in our regions. But now we face challenges at a global scale, requiring a degree of global cooperation, collaboration, tolerance, and mutual understanding that is unprecedented. We need to hurry. We need to understand our circumstances and change our mindsets and adjust our institutions accordingly with these unprecedented challenges. So I'll share my screen, and I thank you for the chance to offer this overview. And let me start here. Sustainable Development, the Future We Want. That title, The Future We Want, is actually the title of a report of a commission that was put in place by then UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to help design the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's a very apt title because it is about the future that we want. What kind of future is it that we want? I think there are 4 pillars of that future, and they are the 4 pillars of sustainable development. The first is to end extreme economic deprivation everywhere. And we can summarize that as the end of poverty or the end of extreme poverty. Indeed, SDG 1, but also some of the other SDGs. And to do that everywhere in the world. During the past 2 centuries, in the period of modern economic growth, much of humanity has escaped from poverty. Taiwan or the United States, my own country, or Europe, where I am today, have essentially escaped from poverty. But some of the world remains trapped in even extreme and abject poverty, causing human suffering in those places and causing destabilization for the entire world. The second pillar of the future we want is more fair and just societies where we live, reduced inequalities within our nations as well as between nations. Already 75 years ago, as I'll emphasize, we adopted an idea of economic rights. That is the right of every person on the planet as a human being to have dignity and enough material means, economic means, to ensure basic human dignity and physical survival and indeed thriving. That is the right to health care, the right to education, the right to social protection, the right to nutrition, now the right to environmental security. This is also part of the future we want: societies that are socially just and that don't have such extreme inequalities that they are torn apart by internal instability. The third pillar of the future we want, as President Xi emphasized, is environmental sustainability. We are facing multiple environmental crises of global human-induced climate change, or specifically global warming, and all of the other climate changes that are going along with that: floods, drought, extreme storms, other upheavals to ecosystems. We are also facing a risk of collapse of biodiversity, massive pollution. And we know with the many emerging diseases of just the past 22 years of this century that we face the risks of new diseases that, of course, create upheaval in the world, as COVID-19 has done. The fourth pillar of sustainable development, indeed at the core of our very survival, is global peace. And once again, in this year, we have ruptures of peace that are terribly threatening to the world. We have designed institutions that can address these challenges. The most important, in my view, is the United Nations and the treaties that the United Nations has made possible, such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the institutions and specialized agencies and goals that the UN has helped to set, including the Sustainable Development Goals. But we are far from fulfilling the vision of the United Nations. We live in a world beset by conflict, by threat, and by dire risks, even risks as we speak right now that are shocking. We hear even talk and charge and countercharges that could lead us to a nuclear conflict, almost unimaginable. And yet this is our present reality. This is the future we want. But there's also a very clear future that we must avoid. That would mean the continuation of poverty, even the increase of poverty in the midst of plenty. In a world that is rich, how can it be that hundreds of millions of people struggle daily for enough food to survive, or for clean enough water to be safe for survival, or for access to emergency health care for even routine matters in the richer countries, but life-threatening in the poorer countries? We want to avoid a future in which our societies are deeply divided on lines of ethnicity, or educational attainment, or digital access. We urgently need to avoid environmental tipping points, but we are extraordinarily close. Environmental tipping points mean that we trespass or surpass planetary safe boundary conditions, that we warm the planet so much that we induce not only more disasters as we are already incurring, but runaway climate change, for example, by melting the permafrost in the tundra region and thereby releasing a massive amount of methane and carbon dioxide that is trapped underneath the ice in the tundra. Or the warming increases temperatures sufficiently to convert much of the current equatorial rainforests, such as in the Amazon, to grassland, because as the temperature warms, there could be very significant drying of the Amazon and other rainforest regions, leading to a catastrophic collapse of those ecosystems. Or mega pollution, and we all know about the plastics and microplastics choking the oceans, and the massive air pollution that claims millions of lives per year that turns into even more runaway disaster. And of course, the future we must avoid is global conflict. There is, as I've said, even in these days and hours, renewed talk about nuclear confrontation, about the threats of war, about new Cold Wars. All of this would spell disaster for humanity, and we must avoid that future. We have choices, but we also must act. The entire premise of sustainable development as an idea, a set of goals, and a policy science is that the future does not take care of itself. There is no invisible hand, as economists have sometimes hoped, that will mercifully guide humanity to a safe future. The future must be designed and built by us through active public policy, through a combination of economic, social, and political institutions, and by a new approach in our own ethical thought to how we interact within our societies and across governments of the world. In other words, the future that we want is the future that we need to build. So the field of sustainable development is about designing that future, and it requires new institutions and new approaches for success. In order to design the future we want, we need to clarify the goals that we have. I've mentioned the pillars of sustainable development being economic, social, environmental, and peaceful interactions globally. So we could say that they are economic objectives to end deprivation, social objectives for social justice, environmental objectives for environmental sustainability and remaining within the planetary boundaries, and multilateral objectives for peaceful societies and global partnership. These are the 4 pillars of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Why 17? Because 193 UN member states spent 3 years negotiating a framework for sustainable development. They did a very good job, but when you have 193 countries, that's a big committee. And they started with a list of 300 proposed goals and conceptualized and narrowed it down over the course of 3 years to 17. It's still a lot, but those 17 sustainable development goals are our framework for achieving these 4 pillars: economic, social, environmental, and peace. Now, it took us 75 years, in essence, to arrive at this concept of sustainable development. I think we can date the concepts in a sense, or at least part of them, back to 1948, because it was 75 years ago next year that the world's governments in the early days of the United Nations adopted a remarkable document known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is one of the glorious documents of our modern age. It's a document that was designed and proposed by a multi-regional, multi-ethnic, multi-philosophical group led by Eleanor Roosevelt to propose universal standards for human dignity, and those included economic, social, cultural, political, and civil rights. And in a sense, I believe this is the basis, the moral and ethical and global ethical basis for sustainable development. 50 years ago this year, the governments of the United Nations met for the first time to discuss the collision course of the economy and the environment. The idea that the world economy could grow so much as to exceed the planetary limits was unthinkable for human beings throughout history. But it became thinkable with the era of modern economic development that started with industrialization at the end of the 18th century. And for the first time in all of human history, economic life continued year after year, decade after decade, with economic growth and expansion, raising living standards, supporting a larger world population, but putting more and more pressure on the environment. It was 50 years ago that this collision course was first recognized diplomatically at the Stockholm Conference, the UN Conference on the Human Environment. And that led to the Stockholm Declaration, which is a diplomatic forerunner of all that came next in sustainable development. In 1987, Dr. Gru Brundtland, the first recipient of the Tang Prize in Sustainable Development, and rightly so, chaired the commission that introduced the concept of sustainable development to us in the report of the Brundtland Commission, Our Common Future. And 5 years after that, the concept of sustainable development was adopted by the world's governments formally at the Rio Earth Summit. And at the Rio Earth Summit, 3 major environmental treaties were adopted. The Treaty on Climate Change, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Convention to combat desertification in the dryland regions. Alas, we have not yet implemented those treaties that we adopted 30 years ago. In the year 2000, the world's governments adopted the Millennium Development Goals as a forerunner of the Sustainable Development Goals, a set of goals to help guide the world's diplomacy towards the end of poverty. In the year 2012, a decade ago, the governments met on the 20th anniversary of the Rio Earth Summit and realized the treaties were not working. And they adopted, therefore, the notion of globally recognized goals, our Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as a framework, a new framework, to help the world understand and shape and build the future we want. In 2015, the governments adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the Paris Climate Agreement as a framework for action on climate. In my interpretation of the Sustainable Development Agenda, I emphasize the fact that building the future means investing in the future. It means putting aside some of our current output for investments in our future capacities, and to shape those investments in ways that will build a future economy and a future global society of the kind that we seek. I emphasize 6 core investments: education is the most important. Taiwan is the living example of a society of excellence in education that propels an entire society to great prosperity and to global leadership in cutting-edge technology. Education is the central investment for sustainable development. The second, and we're reminded of it by the COVID pandemic, is the need for health systems and health services for all. The third core investment is in clean energy that provides the energy for a modern economy in a way that does not threaten the human environment. And that means at the core, shifting from fossil fuel-based energy, which releases climate change and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, to net zero carbon dioxide energy sources, especially zero carbon primary energy such as wind power, solar power, geothermal power, hydropower, and others, and nuclear energy if it can be deployed safely. The fourth core investment is sustainable diets and land use. And this is important to understand because the biggest driver of change of the Earth's land area and the biggest single sector that contributes to greenhouse gases is indeed the farm sector. Feeding 8 billion people in the world every day is a huge task, and it leads to massive pressures on the physical environment. It also leads to unhealthy diets. And so we need a change both in our diets and in our farm practices to render our farm system sustainable. The fifth core investment is our cities, where currently 55% of the world's population lives, but will soon be about 70% of the world population as of 2050. Our cities need to be clean and green and healthful and productive. I'm sure that Taiwan will help to lead the way in clean, green, healthful, and productive cities. Cities will become all electric, run essentially on the zero carbon power systems of the future. And finally, as again, Taiwan knows very well, we have the chance for providing digital services in a way that will improve our lives, make access to healthcare, education, finance, and other crucial areas far more effective, improve public governance, but only if we take care to design digital inclusion for all. So I regard the path to achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals to run through these 6 transformative investment areas. But to achieve this, we also need new methods of governance. We have to design the future. It was easier when we thought, well, the market will do it. Or as we teach in the first day of economics, and then I hope unteach in the later lectures, the invisible hand of the market, we thought, could solve most of our material challenges. But we now understand that in order to combine economic prosperity, social justice, environmental sustainability, and good geopolitical relations, we need new governance structures. And these include several points, each of which is worthy of hours of our discussion and deliberation, but I'll mention them quickly and then elaborate briefly. The first is setting goals. That by itself is a different way of governance from normal politics. Setting long-term goals, decarbonization by mid-century, SDGs by 2030, is an important step of achieving sustainable development. Designing technology pathways and supportive industrial policies is a second pillar of sustainable development. Financial programming to cover the costs, the heavy costs of the investment in the 6 core areas is a third part of governance for sustainable development. Aligning corporate or business incentives with sustainable development is a fourth pillar, because businesses might have the idea that their responsibility is only to their bottom line, but they won't even achieve that unless they are aligned with the broad social direction of sustainable development. A fifth area is regional cooperation, a big challenge. Neighbors need to get along in this world because we need regional cooperation to achieve zero carbon energy systems or sustainable marine environments or sustainable terrestrial environments or sustainable farm practices or secure global supply chains. The sixth area is global cooperation, something that doesn't come easily in the world of statecraft, because global cooperation is not the same thing as alliance politics or balance of power or an anarchic global system. It is active cooperation among nations, even among governments that don't very much agree with each other. And the seventh area of new governance is new ethics, the new ethical underpinnings, the ideas of proper behavior in a world questing to build the future that we want. Let me elaborate briefly on these areas in the short time that I have for the introductory remarks, starting with goal-based development. We have examples of regions setting important goals. I believe that Europe's Green Deal, which has many important components on clean energy, on sustainable land use, on digital economy, on circular economy to reduce pollution and others, is an example of goal-based development. And I often think of the words of one of my favorite presidents, President John F. Kennedy, when he was speaking here in 1963, almost 60 years ago, in a famous speech. He talked about setting goals. He talked about it in the context of making peace. And he said, peace need not be impracticable and war need not be inevitable. And then he said, by defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly toward it. So President Kennedy's style of leadership was to define goals clearly, make them seem manageable, and then help people to be inspired by those goals. One of the famous goals that President Kennedy initiated was the goal to go to the moon. The moonshot in the early 1960s, one of the formative initiatives of my lifetime and my childhood. President Kennedy said, I believe that this nation, the United States, should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. He said that in 1961, and the United States achieved that by 1969. That goal setting inspired America to invest very heavily in that objective, which was a national objective. So this is an example of defining a goal clearly, making it seem manageable, and then bringing people irresistibly toward that goal. It can be done. Another aspect of sustainable development is that all parts of society have an active role to play. This is not only for the business sector or the academic sector or individuals or politics. It is multi-stakeholder. Governments have massive and new responsibilities. While I don't have time to elaborate them, I can list them quickly, and I've mentioned some of them already. Industrial policy, public investments, provision of public services, public financing, global financing, regulation, creating legal frameworks, inducing public-private partnerships, spurring research and development, and promoting public deliberation. But businesses also have a major role to play in the production of sustainable goods and services, in their responsiveness to all of their stakeholders, not only their shareholders, but their suppliers and their customers and the communities in which they operate. In the co-responsibility of global supply chains. By that I mean if a Taiwanese company buys products from Brazil or from some other, from Indonesia or Malaysia, that it takes care that those primary commodities are being produced in a sustainable manner. And businesses also need to be much more attentive to public-private partnership opportunities. Civil society, that's us, also have major responsibilities. The Tang Prize is playing such a wonderful role in helping to promote the concept of sustainable development. The universities have unique responsibilities. So there are multiple roles of civil society in sustainable development. Good citizenship, responsible consumers, schools and universities leading the way, social or not-for-profit businesses, and civil activism are all part of building the future that we want. And Dr. Liu was kind enough to mention the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which I have the honor to lead under the auspices of the UN Secretary General. This is now a network of more than 1,700 universities and think tanks working together to promote sustainable development. So this is an opportunity for universities to play their unique leadership role as part of this multi-stakeholder governance. Now, let me emphasize also the importance of regional integration. And here I have a map of your region, which is East Asia, and showing one example, this one from the Asian Development Bank design, of what a zero carbon energy system might look like. It requires cooperation within the region, and it requires connectivity of the region. Mongolia, for example, in the Gobi Desert has vast wind and solar potential, very few people, but an opportunity to export zero carbon power to the rest of East Asia. That, of course, requires active interconnectivity between Mongolia and China, China and Korea, Korea and Japan, all of these interconnections by linking together diverse sources of renewable energy, wind, solar, hydropower, geothermal energy, can make East Asia into a low-cost powerhouse of zero carbon power, converting a regional energy system that is now based almost entirely on fossil fuels into an energy system that taps the vast renewable energy potential of East Asia and the Pacific region, because it can also incorporate Australia and New Zealand and ASEAN countries. But that requires regional cooperation to make possible. And this, I think, is one of the essential lessons of investing in sustainable development, because it's true not only of the power grid, it's true of ecosystem conservation, it's true of proper rivershed management, It's true of proper management of the fisheries regions. Nature doesn't observe political boundaries. It observes ecosystem logic. And therefore, we need the interconnections across political entities in order to effectively govern, sustain, and steward our natural resources as well. And we know that this also improves economic opportunities if we have peaceful interconnections and trade within regions. Cooperation at the global scale also is absolutely essential. And I want to underscore this in my brief closing remarks. Global cooperation is absolutely essential to end global extreme poverty by sharing financial responsibilities globally, protecting the global environment, because many of our global crises are, our environmental crises are indeed global crises, like human-induced climate change. Resisting global inequality requires global cooperation. Managing the huge demographic changes that are underway, aging populations, declining populations in some regions, rapidly growing populations in other regions, notably in Africa, will require a lot of global cooperation. And of course, essential for every aspect of building the future we want is maintaining peace. And that is the central role of global cooperation, of course. Now, all of this is hard because we are in the midst of a historic change in the global economic order. But it's so important to understand this change, and it would require quite a bit of time to discuss it, but I'll say briefly the following. The blue line here, shown at the top of this graph, is the share of Asia in world output as estimated by economic historians. And what you see is that for most of history, which in this graph starts in the year 1500, but could have even started earlier, Asia was the center of the world economy and world population. But starting in the beginning of the 1800s, that is the early 19th century, that blue line falls sharply. And the gray line underneath it rises sharply with industrialization. The gray line underneath the blue line is Europe's share in the world economy. Asia experiences a relative economic decline. Europe experiences a relative economic increase. And then later in the 19th century, the red line rises sharply. That's North America, essentially the United States and Canada. What we're seeing in this picture is the industrial era, which began around 1800, changing the picture of the world economy. The so-called West, meaning Europe and North America, experienced early industrialization, whereas Asia went into relative decline. Much of Asia succumbed to imperial domination from Europe, such as in India and much of Southeast Asia. Other parts of Asia, such as China, did not industrialize in the 19th century and experienced repeated wars. For example, the two Opium Wars, in which industrial Britain attacked pre-industrial China and caused great havoc and destruction and loss of effective sovereignty, eventually leading to the collapse of the Qing dynasty, of course, in the early 20th century. Only Japan in Asia industrialized by the end of the 19th century, and that was the occasion for Japan's imperialism, which of course Taiwan knows well by its historical experience. But the world changed dramatically with industrialization. Yet starting in the middle of the 20th century, Europe's imperialism ended after 2 world wars, and the blue line, that is the share of Asia in the world, began to rise again sharply. We know this with the dramatic rise of mainland China and Taiwan and the rest of the East Asian economies. Now with India also growing rapidly, Asia is restoring its central place in the world economy. The share of Europe and the United States in the world economy is diminishing in relative terms. All of this is a normal rebalancing after the unusual 200 years in which the West led industrialization. It's a normal, long-term historical rebalancing, but it's leading to profound geopolitical tensions. Most of all, the rise of China is causing great anxieties in the United States especially, and the risk of US-China confrontation, which I very much bemoan because it is a great threat for the world. And in my view, the rise of East Asia to prosperity, Taiwan, mainland China, and the rest of East Asia and much of Southeast Asia is a wonderful example of economic success that we should cherish, not a matter of profound crisis or worry, but this rebalancing is leading to great anxieties and great tensions. And these are the tensions that we need to overcome. If you measure the West, which I define here somewhat artificially as the European Union, US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and the size of East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and the ASEAN countries, you see that East Asia now is larger share of the world economy measured in purchasing power terms than the Western economies. Again, this is leading to anxiety and tensions, which we need to manage peacefully, cooperatively. And I always emphasize in my own country, in the United States, that the rise of East Asia is not a threat to the West. It is a wonderful fulfillment of economic potential that we should take great satisfaction in, but of course, which we should manage for peaceful change in the world. And of course, the tension between the 2 largest economies, the United States and mainland China, are dramatic now. And according to the IMF's data, China is now the larger economy. Not, of course, in per person terms, but in total size. And this, of course, is a source of tremendous nervousness and anxiety in the United States and elsewhere. But it is not a sign, in my opinion, of China's hegemony or dominance, but merely its economic recovery and development. And still, China is perhaps about 1/3 the per capita income level of the United States. But all of this means geopolitical tension. In order to overcome this, I think we need a new ethics of sustainable development. And I know I'm running late, but I'll come to the end of my remarks. The ethics of sustainable development should build on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Religious leaders such as Pope Francis have emphasized, as he says, that interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. This is extremely important. In a fully interdependent world, we need an ethics of global interdependence. We need to think of one world with a common plan. And I believe that we can look back and tap our ancient wisdom, Confucius and his remarkable lasting 2,500 years of wisdom of right behavior, proper behavior, mutual respect, devotion to learning, and Aristotle, shown here on the right, my favorite Western philosopher, who in his hand, you can see the letters ETI. This is his book, The Ethics, because he was the first to define ethics in a scientific manner for Western culture. By tapping this ancient wisdom, in fact, by showing even similarities of virtue in both Confucian and in Aristotelian thought, we can help to forge a global ethics that respects the deep cultural traditions of different parts of the world. We must make peace just as we make sustainable development. And President Kennedy, whom I referred to earlier, said something that resonates with us these days and hours. He said, "The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life." In other words, the stakes have never been higher. Making peace is about our very survival as a species. And for that, we need the United Nations and the shared global values that it represents. And we need the wisdom that President Kennedy invoked and demonstrated in his famous speech that I referred to earlier on June 10, 1963. And let me close my remarks with the wisdom of President Kennedy's speech on that day, when he was appealing for peace between the major powers of that day, and especially calling on Americans to make peace with the Soviet Union, a most remarkable speech. President Kennedy said this: "So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, we can at least help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for this great honor of the Tang Prize in Sustainable Development and for the chance to be with you today in the Tang Prize Masters Forum. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Professor Sachs, for your insightful speech. Before we move on to the panel session, I would like to mention that we have a large number of top high school students in the audience today. Now, for the panel session, let's welcome today's moderator, Academician of Academia Sinica, Dr. Liu Zhaohan, and the panelists, President of National Shen Gong University, Su Huizhen, Dean of Taipei School of Economics and Political Science, Dr. Chen Tianzi, and Chair Professor of National Central University, Professor Liang Xiyuan, to the stage. For our audience, if you have any questions throughout the forum, please remember to scan the QR code and raise your questions online via Slido. Dr. Liu, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank Professor Sachs again for his wonderfully insightful talk. I think during this session, we will have some more time to discuss some of the issues you mentioned. But first, let me introduce the panelists. The three panelists. And first is Professor President Su. And she's an environmental health scientist, and is currently president of National Cheng University, where the position she held since 2015. She has a degree, a doctor's degree from the Harvard Public Health School. And especially, I'd like to mention that Professor Su actually helped to build the interdisciplinary program of sustainable development in Cheng Kung University to become one of the leading universities in the field in Taiwan. And the next panelist I'd like to introduce is Professor Chen Tianzhi. And he is an economist who is special field, I think is in industrial economics, and he has a PhD degree from Penn State, and he has taught in National Taiwan University, and currently is the dean of the Taipei Taipei School of Economics and Social Science, Political Science. Okay, and Professor Chen has held various positions in our government, including the Minister of National Development Council. Next is Professor Liang Qiyuan. He is also the economist, and his field is in the area of energy economics, and he has taught at the University of National Taiwan University and Central University, National Central University. He has a PhD degree in economics from National Taiwan University. He also held positions in our cabinet, for instance, as a minister without portfolio. And the three of them will join us in our discussion for today's talk, today's particular theme, which is the pathway to sustainable development. Professor Sachs, if I may, could I ask you first to a question. as you have traveled widely and met people from all backgrounds and different cultures, do you think people in the world can actually reach a consensus to act together to achieve sustainable development, and how?
Thank you for the question, and what a panel! I'm so thrilled. I have so many questions of the panelists because all of you have such great success, and I need your wisdom also. So I have questions to ask as well. You know, my feeling is that the statement of President Kennedy that I quoted at the end, that we all live on this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal, is the best expression of the commonality of our human interests and goals as individuals. So in all societies, I think that there is a common quest for well-being, for safety, for a brighter future for our children. There is, broadly speaking, a common interest in the Sustainable Development Goals in a very practical sense. All 193 governments of the United Nations have adopted them, which is quite remarkable. But then comes the question of implementation. Implementation is hard. These are not easy objectives. One thing is very few countries have the capacity to plan. For example, the way that Taiwan has successfully planned. Taiwan envisioned its future. Taiwan already 40 years ago thought we need a technology-based future. And Taiwan recruited some of the leading Taiwanese scientists, some who were in the United States. Come home, help us build new industries, new technology base. And Taiwan used in my understanding, a vision approach and a public-private approach to build what is now a most remarkable economy. Most countries of the world, most governments do not have that capacity. So one question is how to develop that capacity. A second problem is that poorer countries generally don't have the means to accomplish what they need to accomplish, even to get their children educated. And this, therefore, poses major financing questions. And I believe if there were more solidarity between the rich and the poor countries, there would be a greater achievement of the SDGs. But the third area is the big power politics. Big power politics makes very difficult a lot of what we need to accomplish because there is so much competition for who is on top, not for the agreement for moving forward together. So I believe that we need statecraft and diplomacy as a major component of this effort, and that this is one of the big challenges. So I very much hope that we can devise more effective diplomatic approaches, because I do think that the core challenges that we face are common challenges. You look at climate change right now, every part of the world is being very hard hit. China is in the midst of massive drought. Europe in the midst of massive drought. The United States is another season of big hurricanes, giant forest fires, and so forth. We have a common interest in addressing these challenges. And so if we can use diplomacy effectively, we will be much farther along.
Thank you. And now I'd like to invite our panelists to talk to our audience. First, President Sue.
Okay, once again, good afternoon. And what I'm extremely humbled by the opportunity and the chance to speak here, being the only non-economist probably present on this forum. But I remember my first encounter or meeting with Professor Sachs was way back some 12, 15 years ago in Colombia when we visited Earth Institute and trying to dig out the wisdom behind that and how we facilitate the whole process of scientific sustainable development by engage different stakeholders. So I guess with that as a premise, I will indulge myself, and thank you for that, to maybe share briefly as a side, and probably our master already mentioned, right in this forum today on the physical venue, we have quite a few, maybe over 100 and more high school, senior high school students with us. And what a more golden opportunity this can be to really plant the first seed of committing to sustainable development with them through some of my brief introduction. So maybe the first slides would be to recap briefly what is already mentioned in Professor Sachs' introduction. But I think the key word for the 1987 report is for the first time, the two critical concepts was mentioned. One is to entertain exactly how much we need. The second would be, would there be a limitation of our resources? And I guess that set a sort of entire conceptual understanding toward the efforts since then, 35 years. And certainly the report has a fundamental impact on how the 1912, on the sort of Rio 20, and later, very much in line with Professor Sachs' lecture title today, The Future We Want report, or acclamation in the Rio Plus 20, released in 2012. And I think for the first time since then, we go very realistically as to how the specific actions should follow. And also, are there means for all this interpretation? Again, I think we are reaffirmed by Professor Sachs today that the implementation is the challenge, whether we can really get it feasibly conducted exercise and therefore realized in different sectors of the society will be something that become a global issue. Now, our next view was, again, every country, when confronting or for encounter the challenges of sustainable development, would definitely be constrained by the factors in the status of their socioeconomic condition, as well as their geographic position, let alone today, very many of us are sort of imposed by the threat of geopolitical situation. But the measure, some sort of a benchmark, standardized, or exercisable globally, that type of framework is critical. So what I have listed on the left part from where you see is some sort of a normative framework that translate the SDG goals into relevant measure, and each nation has a basis for their strategic business model before we can truly have a feasible implementation plan. Sitting in the middle is something that Professor Jeffrey Sachs now is leading as another framework, and later in my presentation, I will share with you how, as an institution at NCKU, now we are representing Taiwan, and in collaboration with our private sector organization to present for the first time Taiwan's data into the SDSN framework. Again, in 2019, Taiwan already released their report in line with or matches the global metrics. But I'd like to draw your attention on the core goal at 18. That's another country's specific position on the nuclear-free homeland. We can have much discussion or debate on this, but again, each country deserves, and each country is entitled, and each country has to face their own decision and their own commitment in what they do. But since I already was introduced by academician Leo, I came from a health background. So I thought I'd take the liberty of also touch upon a few important issues, which links gender or sort of health issue into the whole economic cycle debate. What I have summarized for you specifically lists two scenarios, one before COVID, one in the regular sort of situation. I'd like to mention, if you address or if you look at the table that is scientific reference space, you see female demonstrate stronger innate and humoral immune responses than the males, and are consequently less vulnerable to many bacterial, fungal, or parasital or viral infections. However, men are less likely to report taking protective actions as recommended by either government or society. So what we try to emphasize here, before we move further, every individual and how they position, how they are viewed, how they are understood in the whole system should be fairly scientifically and equally addressed. And I have only limited number of time, but I think it's a continuing effort on the scientific community as well as in the professional community to put together different perspectives of understanding before we can really build a holistically harmonious society together, as the science data will show us. Let me also quickly summarize for you in the following slide. That's looking at the sort of non-infectious but chronic disease. So much in the past time now, so often you probably realize cardiovascular disease can be a leading causes of death. But the treatment given after a CVD event to a woman may be less adequate than men. And the other situation is imposed and challenged by the pandemic situation. Many of the routine checkup, many of the routine visits to all these medical resources are hindered by the situation, and we should come to address that. The other impact really through all these environmental stresses are on the aspect of mental disorder, and the challenge to older women versus to the men are definitely different. But across the board, we have to realize that all this health burden is a part of a very important economic stress to the entire society, not just the environment alone, and not just the economic disparity alone. And finally, if you look them all across the gender, but as age group, you see, for infectious disease, there's no difference whether you are in the young group or sort of older group, because variation in the strain variance by age is unlikely. However, if you look at the sort of non-infectious disease, you can see that there will be a higher instance for air pollution-related problem in the pre-age group versus there would be a different type of heat stress-related depression or higher risk in the air pollution-related depression imposed on the elder group. So finally, I think what I try to summarize here, when we entertain the total development of sustainable society, we need to always bear in mind there's a strong sort of a factor that is likely to intervene all this understanding, namely the socioeconomic condition. So let's bear in mind that continue to realize the differences between the gender, continue to understand further how the risk will be posed differently among different age groups before we can have the complete country plan or national strategy on that. Finally, I think what I summarize here is that we are still in the midst of this sort of pandemic. We have no understanding or we have no exact assurance there won't be another one to hit on. So quickly and effectively to learn from all these scenarios and episodes was something that we can do, everyone on each sector today. And education being a historically being the foundation of the society, have to also realize that continuing the remote education, continuing the online education challenges both the students as well as the faculty, and how the learning efficacy and all this competency coming through all this sort of online education will present definitely another challenge to the society in the near future to come. And we should all bear that in mind and have a full understanding toward it. Finally, and to take our own responsibility and take whatever we can do as an individual institution. We are now, and not knowing Professor Sachs will be receiving the Tang Prize honorable laureate, we launched this self-initiated, proactive effort in put together Taiwan's first SDSN network, empowered by not only my own academic group here, faculty at NCKU, but across the whole country, and also facilitated by loyal and engaged, dedicated local organization as part of the platform put together of the information. So Professor Sachs, hopefully by early fall or later part of the November, we will formally launch all this information up to the network and be in a loyal, engaging partner of the society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Su. Next, I'd like to invite Professor Chen.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to join this very important event. As an economist, I was always amazed by these sustainable development issues. For example, you look at the SDG goals, there are 17. And you start to wonder, how can you have so many tools to achieve all of them, right? They are so different. But as economists, I have the kind of, how do we say that, the prejudice to say that maybe economic development is the most important tool that we can have. Most of these goals, among these 17 of them, could be resolved if people get richer. You know, for example, the first one is the elimination of poverty, right? Eradication of poverty. It's obviously, you don't have a problem if you're rich, right? Other things such as healthcare, good education, environmental security, ability to control the damage of the environment, which will all pretty much come with the economic success. You have economic development successfully, then probably most of the so-called sustainable development issues could be resolved, right? And for Professor Sachs is really tremendous. He has actually written many books on these issues, including today's speech, which is spectacular, to tell you what happens after the industrialization, right? Roughly beginning 18,000, people learn how to use machine to do the production. And the world was already changing. And you know, you can imagine that the population on the earth has tremendously increased. China in particular was somehow, you know, missed the trend in this new age coming. And therefore, you see the decline of the Chinese GDP in world output beginning roughly in 1800. Economists, medicine, which is mentioned by Professor Sachs in the speech, he has historical data for the world production from 1800 until today. And he shows that in 1820, it's roughly a few years after the death of Qianlong Emperor, the Chinese GDP still accounts for about 1/3 of the world production. It's 32.9% precisely. And that percentage begin to decline, you know, in year after year. Before China undertook this so-called reform and opening in 1978, the GDP of China accounts for only 5% of the world total. So that's the blue line that you have seen in the Professor's Sachs PPT. And of course, after this reform and opening in 1978, the Chinese economy began to pick up steam, and therefore the share of Chinese GDP in world production also increased from 5% to today's roughly 20%. Depends on how much confidence you have on the Chinese statistics. But in any way, it's a very dramatic improvement in terms of the productivity, right? And therefore, that will show in the living standard of the ordinary Chinese people, right? For example, the life expectancy, which is one indicator we usually use to measure this sustainable thing. The average life expectancy, the average life of Chinese people has increased by 10 years between 1978 and today. Okay, it was an increase from 67 years to now about 77 years. So this is a tremendous benefit. Chinese education level has increased so much, right? Publication, scientific publication, and the other industrial output, all these indicators will show a dramatic improvement in the human welfare in the economic sense. But my question, I think many people here in Taiwan will probably have the same question as mine, is this model, the way that China has been developing until today, is this really sustainable? Can this model of economic success over the last 40 years, which was so dramatic from any measurement that you want to put on it, is this model really sustainable? Right? We talk about the environmental problem, which is quite obvious. All the speakers and our commentators all talk about this. And I think the government of China is already aware of the problem. And they have also have good, I think, a very good program to cope with the climate change now. Okay, so they realize there is a limitation, a potential sort of a problem coming from the constraint of the nature. That is fine. Okay, the real serious problem, I think, which is in Professor Sachs' speech, is that this is probably not enough to make the Chinese model sustainable. China has been trying to export its model to other countries, right, such as African countries, Sri Lanka, and up to this point, you see their problem there, the implementation and result coming out of this problem. The biggest challenge, of course, is the geopolitics, right? The U.S. is now worried about the rise of China. So therefore, you begin to wonder that when your economic power increase as a result of economic growth over the last 40 years, you become a threat to the world, right? At least there are many countries consider China as a threat. And so therefore, this pattern, we have spent so much resources and preaching the other developing countries to become richer. But once they become rich, they may become a threat to us, right? That's the kind of dilemma that we are facing today. And people here in Taiwan, of course, are particularly conscious of this, what's happening on the sky. The Chinese airplane has been flying over to intimidate our daily life every day, right? What kind of problem are you facing? And I think in today's speech, I got really good hint from there, and that is essentially the most important thing is not economics. It's probably the ethics. It's the value. what you are really trying to pursue, right? Not really the richness of people, right? But the value of the people, the human right, the real dignity of as a person, magnification of your talent, be able to enjoy life and liberty, right? So this ethic, I think, is the most important thing that we need to be able to somehow to persuade the world. You could have a different, as John F. Kennedy's speech will tell you, we have to be aware of the differences between countries. And we have to be tolerant, right, of this difference between the countries, right? Better yet, if you're a Buddhist like myself, you better appreciate the differences. You appreciate that people are different from you. But how can you do this, as Dr. Liu's initial question? How can you make countries with different political systems, different cultural value to work together toward this eventual goal of this sustainable development, right? And I think the only thing we can do is if we learn to respect each other. And that made me to think that the Human Rights Declaration in 1948 was so important, right? If you do not respect human rights, then you have a policy like what China is doing today. You have a zero COVID case policy, right? Which from the mind of the leader of the country is probably nothing. I'm doing something good for the society because I want to control this spread of disease, right? So as that we can maintain economic stability and people can have a better life. But by doing so, you're really you impose these authoritarian restriction on the very basic right of people, right? The freedom of movement, and then that proved in the end this is not good for economic activity either, right? So I think we really have to, when we talk about this multidisciplinary training program, I think the essence of this sustainable development issue, it is multidisciplinary by nature, right? And then it's probably important to bring philosophy there, to get into this, and so therefore, in the end, there must be some commonality between people in different parts of the world, and that has to be discovered and educated and believed by all those people before this goal can ever be achieved. Otherwise, when you get richer, you feel this country become more threatening your security, and the war never ended. When people get richer, and there seems to be a war coming. When UK becomes so rich, this imperialism, the British imperialism, has done a lot of bad things in the world. And you look at the war in Russia and Ukraine now. So all these things, I think, give us really hard lessons. I appreciate the speech today and have learned a lot from it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Chen and Professor Liang.
Okay. So, first I would like to congratulate Professor Sachs to be awarded at the 2022 Tang Prize Laureate in Sustainable Development. He has a very important contribution about the sustainable development of the world, but also he is also has a very successful advice on many governments in the world. That is on hyperinflation market economic reforms, regional development, and health systems. Take this precious opportunity, I would like to ask Professor Sachs' advice on the following 3 questions. First, it's about Taiwan's energy policy. That is the policy starting from 2016. That is the core of the policy is to pursue a zero nuclear energy policy by 2025. That is that policy we can outline this policy from this table. First, this first column is real data, real electricity composition of Taiwan in 2016. So nuclear at the time is about 12% of electricity composition, and going to be zero after 9 years by 2025. And coal fire at that time is 16% down to 30%. Okay? So that is in 9 years, that is a dramatic change. So what we substitute, nuclear and coal fire, renewable. Renewable we increase from 4.8% to 20% after 9 years by 2025. And gas fire, we increase less than 32% to 37%. Okay? So, but the target is 50% by 2025. But you can compare 2021. After 5 years of 2016, the renewable only increased 1.2 percentage point. So after 4 years, we are going to achieve, we had to add another 14 percentage point to reach 20, right? Very difficult. And gas fire, after 4 years from 2016, only increased less than 6%. But in future 4 years, we are going to add another 13 percentage point. So assuming electricity consumption is zero, we still have the problem, not enough to substitute coal fire and nuclear, right? So that means that we are going to have power shortage, okay? So it really happened. At 2017, we have a nationwide blackout. And last year, we have twice national blackout. And this year, in March, we have another nationwide blackout. Okay? This is related with not enough power. And then, since we are using more expensive nuclear and more expensive coal-fired power plant, and also renewables to substitute cheaper nuclear and coal-fired power plant. So the electricity price research, by my study, it at least will increase 114% higher than the average, than the price of 2017. Okay? And then we know, since we have a power shortage, so we had to use coal. Okay? So we are using more coal instead of using less coal in the future. So the CO2 emission and pollution will be worsened in the future. And number 4 problem, because more than 2/3, okay, of nuclear is located in the north. So the North electricity shortage is the worst in Taiwan. So they will rely the transmission line, okay? And so the grid risk, it's a grid risk, it's very risky. One transmission tower collapse, that will cause a nationwide blackout. Energy security. Our stockpiling for LNG, it's only lasting in the summertime 8 days, in wintertime 15 days. That is far less than the international standard. For instance, the PRC, mainland China and Korea, is more than 50 days. And Japan is 30 days. And Germany is 65 days. So after we know the military maneuver recently happened, that is lasting for 4 days. But it's in the summertime, 8 days. This problem is not only energy security problem, it's a national security problem. So I would like Professor Sachs' advice. Could you give Taiwan government applicable advice? This is the first question. Second question, 136 countries in the world has joined the movement of the zero carbon emission by 2050 in the world, okay? To achieve the goal, what kind of key policy would be suggested? I mean specifically supply side policy and demand side policies. Okay. And number 3, after the visit of the Congress Speaker Pelosi to Taiwan, the tension between Taiwan and mainland China has been escalating. Could you advise our government and our people for dealing with the tangled relationship among Taiwan, mainland China, and the United States? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Liang. Professor Sachs, would you like to respond?
Thank you for the easy questions. But thanks to all 3 of the distinguished panelists for wonderful remarks and comments. And let me respond to all of them, if I may. First, with President Su, thank you for your vision of a holistic approach to health systems and health policy, and so important, the human side, comparing the biological gender issues and the social gender issues. And this is extremely insightful. Let me also make a statement and also ask a question back to you. Taiwan's response to COVID was remarkable in my understanding from what I could see. From the first earliest reports that there was a new outbreak in Wuhan, Taiwan reacted almost immediately. And I think the memory of SARS was enough, and also the distrust of what's going on over there prompted a quick response. Taiwan was able to maintain essentially a suppression policy of keeping transmission at extraordinarily low levels. And I think this is a great success. And then afterwards, of course, this was relaxed, but post-vaccination. And so the consequences were much more limited, adverse consequences. In the United States, we had chaos, by the way. We had no conception of how to fight an epidemic. We had no functioning control systems. We did not have contact testing, tracing, and isolation. So we had a free-for-all, even opposition to face masks. And the result was 1.2 million deaths in the United States. Really shocking, amazing. So I have a question of how we can impart this kind of system wisdom to other countries, because I think the success of the idea of suppression was not even an idea in the United States. There was just confusion. Oh, we don't want a lockdown forever. And then that means we must have a free-for-all forever. So we never found the right path. Even till today, in retrospective understanding, we have almost no understanding of what a prudent and safe path is. So I just want to mention that because I think that Taiwan's experience has a lot to teach, and it needs to be better understood. The mainland is in a also very tricky situation because it also succeeded in suppression, but it has maintained the zero COVID policy even now. And Omicron is very, 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 very hard to fight because it's so infective. And so lockdowns continue in a major way in the mainland, and it's very disruptive at this point. So the challenge is extremely great. Both Professor Chen and Professor Liang asked, how do we actually move operationally to sustainable development? And I so much appreciated Professor Chen's emphasis on the role of ethics and understanding as key. It is a fact, and it really needs to be understood, that China's mere success is part of the US anxiety. In other words, it's not whatever also China's actions, but the mere size and growth of China was viewed by US policymakers as a threat. This is a big problem because it's almost like saying, if you develop, you're a threat. And that by itself means finding a path to a peaceful world is very hard because of course China wants to develop. In China's history, China was the lead of the world in technology for more than 1,000 years. And so the idea that China should not catch up after more than 100 years of falling behind is of course unthinkable. So, but the American policy reaction, which I saw early on, was we need to be afraid because China's so big. And fear can then lead to reaction, counter fear, and we get what is called the strategic dilemma, where each side becomes more and more hostile in reaction to what the other side views as a defensive action. And we get a deterioration, very significant deterioration of relations. This, I think, is absolutely our threat right now, because in the American side, which I can speak about with some experience after 67 years as an American, there's very little understanding of perceptions and perspectives of any place else. America is separated by two oceans. There's a great deal of pride. There's some arrogance coming from economic success and military strength. And there's very low capacity to actually understand. And this is part of our education system as well, which is not good in terms of really training a good understanding of the world. So there's a sense of threat that the US feels that is exaggerated. And that has been true of many parts of the world for a long time in America. And it's very dangerous because the fear can become self-fulfilling. Now, the question Professor Chen asked is, how to overcome this, how to appreciate differences. In my view, there is one basic idea which I subscribe to. It's very simple, very simplistic maybe, but I subscribe to it. And that is to overcome fear, have dialogue with counterparts, talk, discuss, even develop friendships and normal relationships among policy makers and policy leaders. There's a lot of experimental evidence and experimental game theory that shows that mere talk, just talk, what economists call cheap talk, makes a huge improvement in the capacity to cooperate because it humanizes the other side. And so I believe that we need a lot more dialogue, not just fear. And I really have emphasized to the US government for years, make systematic dialogue with China on many issues, even bureaucratically in place, so that it happens each month, every 2 months, on a regular basis.
Talk about some Professor Sachs' response to my question, which is, there are some differences which is really difficult to resolve, right? You may never be able to resolve. But however, to kind of understanding that if you resort to a conflict, such as a war, and the cost, of course, is obvious and tremendous. So dialogue itself, the enemies, even enemies, they dialogue. And we do see that, for example, the American policy right now towards the China is keep dialoguing, and we do see that happening. And of course that, the one question I actually, because of running out of time, is Professor Sachs in a book, in recent book, and he was talking about the confrontation between U.S. and Soviet Union, and that lasts for almost 50 years, right? Until 1989, when the Soviet Union was eventually dissolved. And in between, this was a period called Cold War. But actually, the hot war never happened between these two big powers. There are wars in other parts of the world, maybe sponsored by these two superpowers, but the war never really happened between the two superpowers themselves. And so the history, and of course they even in that period, the economic linkage between the two powers continue. And there's no lack of diplomatic dialogue either. So that's if history is going to repeat itself, then we probably will see the same kind of thing happening between U.S. and China. And of course, Taiwan, sitting in between, and was hot spot of this strategic competition. Our risk is much higher than the other two. He's back, sorry. I just try to sort of jump in to fill the blank when you are, suddenly disappear from the line. That's pretty much, actually, Professor Sachs has a very recent book called The 7 Ages of Globalization, in which he just tracked pretty much the human history from 100,000 years ago until the industrialization age. And in the book, I will just stop here. I just try to introduce your new book to the audience. Ask them to read your new book.
Thank you. I apologize. I think my internet got exhausted after 2 hours, or 3 hours. So I'm back, and I'll try to be brief. I hope I won't get interrupted again by the internet, and I apologize. But just to say, I think that the most important thing we can do practically right now is talk with each other. I believe that's what we as academics do all the time. I have so many students, so many colleagues, so many co-researchers in all parts of the world. And it creates a commonality of feeling and a commonality of experience. And in the United States, we don't speak enough with our counterparts. I urged that we negotiate with President Putin. I urged that we discuss with the PRC and so forth. And I believe that this, to be a little bit simplistic, is the that we should be doing right now, because there are so many misunderstandings, different perspectives. I know it because I go back and forth between countries. I speak to both sides all the time. And in this sense, I think that we could overcome these misunderstandings. Let me turn to Professor Liang's questions about the energy policy, if I might. The first thing that's needed is a plan to 2050. And that is a realistic plan. Where will Taiwan's energy come from, or for any other country? To be a zero carbon energy system, one needs a framework, and it needs to be realistic, and it needs to be quantified. And most governments don't do their homework. They just do incremental measures, like by 2025, we will be so-and-so, but that's not good enough, because it then doesn't even materialize. And then there's a dead end. What happens afterwards? And so there's little confidence in the financial system. There's little confidence among the energy providers, the utility companies. There's little guidance for land use. There's no strategy. And so there needs to be a framework. And very few countries have a framework, but some do. And that was the idea of the Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project. Now, Taiwan has a specific issue, which is there is very limited land. Taiwan does not have a vast desert for solar power. It doesn't have vast potential for hydropower or anything like that. And so it doesn't have clear choices on what the zero carbon energy system will be. And therefore, Taiwan has to think very clearly. Now, in that context, nuclear power could be a real option. And of course, all of the neighboring countries are using nuclear energy. And Japan, after Fukushima, of course, also closed its system, but now it's turning the nuclear power back on. Korea will continue to use nuclear energy. China, mainland China, will continue to use nuclear power, and so forth. There are improved passive safety systems that can greatly secure nuclear power compared to even the Fukushima design or earlier design. So I would say that this is for a country with a limited, any place with a limited land area, a high population density, and a lack of obvious zero carbon energy sources. This has to be viewed as one part of what a pathway would look like and what it would contain. But there's another big challenge, and it goes back to this question of cooperation. And it's a very difficult challenge under Taiwan's current situation, which is that in principle, one could have an integrated grid for Northeast Asia. There's no reason that Taiwan could not power itself with Gobi Desert renewable energy, in fact, because there could be a regional grid and a lot of hydropower from the eastern boundaries of Russia, for example, and so forth. But this requires trust. This requires a sense of security and national security. And that trust doesn't exist right now. But the economic costs of the loss of trust are extremely high. And I think that this is needs to be understood. The distance from Xiamen to Taichung City is about 250 kilometers. That's a pretty routine submarine cable. So one could, if there were a high level of trust, connect the mainland and Taiwan power grid and make all sorts of solutions that don't exist right now. Norway and the Netherlands have a submarine cable that's twice as long as that. And with new technology, now there's talk, very realistic talk, of 1,000 kilometer or 1,500 kilometer submarine cables. But countries connected in energy need trust. And what's happening in Europe right now is a manifestation of the risk, which is that Russia was the low-cost provider of natural gas to Europe. And now with the war, Russia has cut off the gas and Europe is in a very deep crisis. Now, without going into long detail, I believe that this war could have been avoided, should have been avoided, and had there been proper understanding, this crisis would never have taken place. I have to say, hold the US partly responsible because it pushed NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia in the Black Sea, which was viewed by Russia, understandably, as a deep national security threat. So the US kept pushing, even when Russia kept saying, please don't push any farther, don't push any farther. You are a threat to us. And the United States doesn't hear such things. The US says, we get to decide what we do, and doesn't listen when other countries say, you are threatening us. Do not threaten us. Russia said this for 30 years. I know because I was advisor to the Russian government for part of that time. I was advisor to the Ukraine government for part of that time. And I heard what they were saying, and I conveyed that to Washington, but Washington didn't listen because they're a little hard of hearing. They only hear what they want to hear. And so, but to come back to energy, the low-cost solution for Northeast Asia or for East Asia is an interconnected system. But that requires a high level of trust. And therefore, it requires really a sense of dialogue, common purpose, many countries involved, and even engineering options that make no one place only dependent on one other place. And I think that this is also two kinds of engineering: geopolitical engineering and energy system engineering. But I would say that for Taiwan, finding that pathway is extremely important. Being honest about it. Which kinds of primary energy sources? How can that be consistent with security? Which regions will we be trading energy with? What are the relative costs? What are the land use demands of alternatives? How much could offshore wind enable Taiwan to meet energy needs? And finding a timeline that is realistic, because suddenly phasing out nuclear without having alternative options is to nobody's favor. This, of course, is what Germany did. It's what Japan did. It's what Taiwan is doing in reaction to Fukushima. But it is not sound energy policy. One needs a framework that is a comprehensive and sound framework. So I am in favor of a multi-pronged approach. First, most importantly, develop alternative pathways in a quantified 30-year framework. In the United States, my colleagues have developed 8 pathways, some with nuclear, some without nuclear, some with carbon capture and storage, others without carbon capture and storage. But then they have compared them. They've compared the costs and the realism of them. So that's one thing. Second is what can be done by expanding regional cooperation. Now, this is very tricky in Taiwan's current context, but I think for energy systems in general, it's extremely important. And third, on the question of Speaker Pelosi's visit and its aftermath, we need dialogue urgently, because if it's only taking the worst of the other side, and that's what is happening right now, we will get into an escalation cycle. We are in an escalation cycle that's very dangerous. And I believe that dialogue would help all sides to understand what are the respective positions, what are the respective interests, what are the respective security needs. I hope I'm not naive in believing that there is an absolutely peaceful and mutually constructive approach. That is my strong view. And it's not only my hope, but it's also my understanding. But we're not naturally gravitating towards that right now, because there's very little trust and very little discussion. And the war in Ukraine has exacerbated the distrust. To my colleagues in the United States government, or my compatriots in the US government, my message is speak with your counterparts, because they have a point that needs to be heard. And if you listen better, we actually can find a peaceful resolution of the war in Ukraine, and we can find a peaceful resolution of the increasing and incredible tensions in your region as well. So that is my recommendation and my hope.
Okay, thank you. Because of time, I'll direct one last question, actually, to President Su. And actually, the question is, many young people in Taiwan actually understand that human-induced climate change has led to environmental disruption. They want to do something. They want to find effective ways to contribute to achieving the SDGs. Any advice to them?
Well, being here is a good start to understanding the context of it, and then to put forward your soul rather than just your thoughts. I think your thought, believing there's a common good that across the whole world, people would, regardless of the different cultural background, sort of religious background, political status and belief, there's a place that people would join together, and that's a responsibility that we owe to the next generation to secure and prepare and engage in working for a better future for them together. And everyone has a role to play in getting yourself more knowledgeable about the context of it, and bring yourself up to date with the gaps, the needs, and try to participate. Try to participate in any form you can. And before you know it, you are already out there and fighting for the good cause, and being the strong champion and ambassador for us all. That would be my belief. And Professor Sachs was inspiring us, long years ago, and that's what I continue to do. And I believe we can do that. Yes.
Okay. I think we have already run out of time. And I have learned a lot from Professor Sachs and Professor Chen, Professor Liang, and President Su. And well, it's time for the audience, for the panelists to say goodbye to Professor Sachs. And hopefully, we can meet in person pretty soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.